welcome. I'm so glad you all could be here. I'm Beth, she, her pronouns from Book Group Services here at MCPL, and I will be the facilitator. Some best practices for this program are we ask you to stay muted during Doug's presentation. Feel free to put questions in the chat and I will be monitoring. This will be recorded for archival purposes. And for those of you who have checked out physical copies from the Booktalk collection, I will be monitoring your due dates. And please feel free to email booktalk@mymcpl.org if you have any questions. So I would love to introduce Doug Richardson of the National Park Service. Doug is about to start his 30th year with the National Park Service and has served at 8 national parks in 4 states. Almost 34 years ago, he decided to study history and history education in college, in part inspired by the writing of David McCullough. He has been at the Truman home since January 2017 and started developing programs with Mid-Continent weeks after his arrival. Truman was always his dream park because of the book we are discussing today. He and his wife are staunch believers in the public library, and yes, his wife made him say that last line. So take it away, Doug.
Thank you, Beth, and thank you all for joining us today. I am speaking to you today from the Green Hills branch of Mid-Continent Public Library, and Mid-Continent is a wonderful partner of Harry S. Truman National Historic Site and the National Park Service. We are grateful to Mid-Continent and all of the employees of Mid-Continent. My name is Doug Richardson, and it's an honor to be with you today. So welcome to the July 2023 installment of a guided tour of Truman. This is our tribute to David McCullough and our guided walk through his wonderful biography of the 33rd President of the United States. And indeed, this is brought to you by the staff of Harry S. Truman National Historic Site, which is a unit of the National Park Service and Mid-Continent Public Library. And I wanted to begin this session with a thank you to those of you joining us today and to all of the American people and those of you who helped make Harry S. Truman National Historic Site a reality. Many times you'll hear the phrase, well, you know, it's going to take an act of Congress. Well, oftentimes, to create a national park unit, it sometimes does. And in the case of the creation of my national park, which is your national park, it really did. And it all started with the will of Mrs. Bess Wallace Truman. She died in October of 1982. And in her will, she left her family's home at 219 North Delaware Street and its contents to the American people. And when that will was being probated, we learned that it was first left to the National Archives, and the National Archives very quickly involved the National Park Service in the process. And very quickly, the local congressional delegation got involved, and in short order, in May of 1983, legislation was passed, and by the end of May 1983, that legislation was signed establishing Harry S. Truman National Historic Site as a unit of the National Park Service. And it took so many people for that to happen. And so 40 years later, we are a thriving national park unit. Millions of people have come to Independence, Missouri and Grandview, Missouri to learn about President Truman, Mrs. Truman, their family. And we are so grateful to you and everybody who has made that happen on our 40th anniversary. And we look forward to the next 40 years and more. So for those of you who maybe are like me, who love legislation, here's the legislation, Public Law 9832. Thank you so very much for that. The last time that we met, we ended talking about 1944, when United States Senator Harry S. Truman began making that transition from being a United States Senator to being the nominee as Franklin Roosevelt's final vice presidential candidate. Harry S. Truman had made a national name for himself as the chairman of a rather powerful Senate committee that was investigating waste and fraud in defense appropriations, what was nicknamed the Truman Committee. It got him a lot of attention in the press, landed his picture on the cover of newspapers and magazines and newsreels. And because of that recognition and because of electoral math, Harry Truman was now a pretty famous man, and his name was being talked about as a potential nominee to run with Franklin Roosevelt for that fourth term. Truman was not necessarily happy about this. Truman would have loved to have spent the rest of his public service life in the United States Senate, but when he recognized that Roosevelt was happy for this, and when he recognized that it was his destiny, Truman agreed, and he campaigned very heartily for the ticket, and that ticket of Roosevelt Truman won in November of 1944. So I wanted to begin today, courtesy of C-SPAN, and I wanted to share with you a clip of the January 20th, 1945 inaugural ceremony, the rare time that an inaugural ceremony was held at the White House.
White House in Washington, crowds gather for the inauguration of Franklin D. Roosevelt as President of the United States for a fourth term. Invitations admit 7,000 guests to the White House grounds. Among the guests are wounded servicemen from nearby military hospitals. The south portico of the White House, the crowd lines up. For the first time, an inauguration is held not at the Capitol building, but here in the president's own backyard. From the portico steps, 13 grandchildren of the president watch the ceremony. At the bottom of the steps is Harry Hopkins, presidential advisor and aide. Government leaders arrived for the ceremonies. Secretary of War and Mrs. Stimson. Secretary of Navy and Mrs. Forrestal. Secretary of the Interior, Harold Ickes. Harlan Fiske Stone, Chief Justice of the United States. Admiral of the Fleet, Ernest King. Edward R. Stettinius, Secretary of State, and Mrs. Stettinius. General of the Armies, George C. Marshall and Mrs. Marshall. Now, in a grim year of war, the shortest and simplest inaugural on record begins. Former Vice President Wallace swears in Harry Truman, new Vice President. President Roosevelt takes the oath of office.
I, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, do solemnly swear that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States and will, to the best of my ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States.
So help you God.
So help me God.
The president delivers a brief inaugural address.
we Americans of today, together with our allies, are passing through a period of supreme test. It is a test of our courage, of our resolve, of our wisdom, of our essential democracy. If we meet that test successfully and honorably, we shall perform a service of historic importance. Which men and women and children will honor throughout all time. As I stand here today, having taken the solemn oath of office, in the presence of my fellow countrymen, in the presence of our God, I know that it is America's purpose that we shall not fail. In the days and the years that are to come, we shall work for a just and honorable peace, a durable peace, as today we work and fight for total victory in war.
And there was a wonderful Roosevelt smile. Peace was within reach, but it wasn't quite there yet. Allied forces were closing in on Berlin. Allied forces were closing in on Japan, but the war was still raging. And I often wonder, as the new vice president was watching Franklin Roosevelt being sworn in, I wonder what was going through Harry Truman's mind. But just a few days after Harry Truman became the new vice president of the United States, he found himself embroiled in a few scandals. The first of which involved the funeral of an old friend and mentor of his. Thomas Pendergast died. Now, Thomas Pendergast, of course, had been instrumental in the political rise of Harry Truman. After the failure of Truman and Jacobson haberdashers in Kansas City, Truman embarked in a public service career as Truman was elected as Eastern District County Judge in Kansas City and Jackson County, Missouri, and then presiding judge in Jackson County, and then eventually as United States Senator. All of that was made possible in part because of the Pendergast machine here. And Truman knew that. Well, when Truman entered the United States Senate, one of the nicknames that Truman had was the senator from the great state of Pendergast. And so Truman had that black cloud over his head. He knew that. But Truman eventually became his own man. But even so, Truman kept a portrait of Pendergast in his office in the United States Capitol. Truman never disassociated himself with Pendergast. And even as a United States Senator, he never broke ranks with Pendergast. And so when Pendergast died on January 26th of 1945, Vice President Truman came back home to attend his funeral, and it sparked an outrage in many parts of the country, and sparked an outrage even further that Vice President Truman used a military plane to come home and attend a funeral. And the vice president simply said, well, one never forgets a friend. But one of the ways of looking at that is that that phrase, one never forgets a friend, can say a lot about the character of Harry Truman. And it reminds me of the story that late in life, as a relatively old man, one day in a ferocious winter day, there was a funeral in Independence, Missouri, and there were very few attendees at a funeral. And the minister noticed that a car pulled up and an old man got out of the car, and it was former President Harry Truman. And the minister was surprised and said, "Mr. President, the weather is atrocious. Why are you here?" And the former president said, "Well, you never forget a friend." So Truman came to Tom Pendergast's funeral. A few days after that, on February 10th of 1945, Vice President Truman came to perform at a USO function to benefit the troops. Now, Vice President Truman had been playing the piano for a very long time. If you remember from many sessions before, his parents had invested in playing the piano for him. Even as a boy, they bought a piano for him. And Truman himself, if he had continued with the lessons, could have been a professional piano player. And he loved the piano, and he was invested that day, February 10th of 1945, in performing for the boys. Well, also there that day was a young actress by the name of Lauren Bacall. And before Vice President Truman knew it, the young actress popped up on the top of the piano. And next thing everybody knew, the vice president was looking up at the young actress. And the photographers happened to snap the photograph of the vice president looking up at the young actress, who happened to be the wife of Humphrey Bogart. And next thing you knew, this photograph started to appear in newspapers and in newsreels across the country. And another scandal erupted. How serious was the scandal? Relatively serious, and you have to remember this is 1945, and Lauren Bacall is a young, beautiful lady, and the vice president is looking up at her. But probably worse for the vice president was the response that he received at home. The tradition has been passed down from the family of Vice President Truman that when he got home, once Mrs. Truman heard the story, she was not happy. She looked at her husband and said that it was probably best that he not play the piano in public any longer. So there are not very many examples of Harry Truman playing the piano in public after this incident very often. But there are some very interesting stories that follow this, and I just wanted to share one with you. We're going to jump the timeline a little bit. One of my favorite documents from the Truman collection comes from a few years later. Harry Truman had a very interesting bet with Lauren Bacall and her husband, Humphrey Bogart, regarding what they thought would be the gender, the sex of their first child, and the bet was for $20. And well, Mr. and Mrs. Bogart lost the bet on that. And so they wrote a check to President Truman for $20 and sent it to President Truman in 1949 to the White House. And President Truman returned it to the Bogarts and said that they could put that money towards the young man's educational fund. And it's just a wonderful document. And 1949 was a very serious time, and sometimes it's a reminder to see that sometimes there is some fun in life. To jump back to 1945, I wanted to share what may be the last photograph of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. You got a hint when you watched that video of Roosevelt's inauguration that the war and the presidency had taken its toll on Franklin Roosevelt, the 12 years, starting with the Depression and then with everything that had happened with World War II. For years, Roosevelt had been dealing with heart issues and congenital heart failure. And you can see it in his face. So in March, he had traveled to Warm Springs to rest and relax. And while there, some people said that he was looking better, but it was not to be. So a little less than 24 hours after this particular photograph was taken, Franklin Roosevelt died. It was April 12th, 1945. On April 12th, 1945, Vice President Harry S. Truman was presiding over the United States Senate. Harry Truman loved the Senate. Now, vice presidents over the years have had various nicknames for the office of the vice presidency. One of the constitutional jobs of the vice president is to preside over the United States Senate, and that's what Vice President Truman was doing. I wanted to share with you one of the things that Truman did. On April 12, 1945, Vice President Truman wrote a letter home to his mother and to his sister, Mrs. Martha Ellen Young and Miss Mary Jane Truman in Grandview, Missouri. And in this letter, in part, he told Mama and told Mary Jane that he was going to be on the radio that evening and to make sure that they listened. After the Senate adjourned, they adjourned to the office of the Speaker of the House, and they were about to convene what they called the Board of Education. And what that meant was that they were going to play cards and they were going to sip some drinks. And Truman recalled in his memoirs, he begins his memoirs with a story, that he was notified in the office of the Speaker of the House that he got a phone call from Roosevelt's press secretary, Steve Early, that he was asked to come to the White House quickly, quietly. So Truman made his way to the White House. He was escorted on an elevator, and when he got off the elevator, he immediately greeted Mrs. Eleanor Roosevelt, who looked at him and said, "Harry, the president is dead." And Truman was stunned. And he said, "Mrs. Roosevelt, is there anything I can do for you?" And she said, "No, Harry, is there anything I can do for you? For you are the one in trouble now." Harry Truman's first decision as President of the United States was to allow Mrs. Roosevelt to use a military plane, a government plane, to go down and see her husband's body at Warm Springs. And then the second decision was to allow the United Nations meeting scheduled for the end of April to proceed. And then Truman gave the order to coordinate the swearing in at the White House. And so those preparations began. The address that Franklin Roosevelt and the talk that Truman mentioned in his letter to Mama Truman and Mary Jane, of course, did not happen. The letter that I share with you on the screen, it looks like a copy, and it is. And there's a story behind that. When Harry Truman was writing his memoirs in the middle of the 1950s, he borrowed these letters from his sister, Mary Jane Truman, because he wanted to make sure and help his ghostwriters and researchers make sure that facts and dates and such were were correct. And so he borrowed these letters from Mr. And then the letters were deposited in eventually the new Truman Library. And at some point, Miss Mary Jane Truman took the letters back. And at some point, Mary Jane Truman then destroyed the original letters. I would like to go back in time and ask Mary Jane Truman exactly why she did that. I would like to do the same thing with Mrs. Bess Truman, who we know destroyed a lot of her correspondence to her husband. I know a lot of people of that generation did that. They had a sense of privacy. I would like to know the answer to that, but thankfully, when President Truman and his researchers and folks borrowed these letters from Mary Jane Truman, they made these copies. And so thankfully at the Truman Library, they have these first generation copies in storage, but I wish we knew more. I wish we knew more. So at 7:09 p.m., Franklin Roosevelt's cabinet, where as many as possible were gathered, the Chief Justice of the United States gathered, and under a portrait of Woodrow Wilson, Harry S. Truman was inaugurated as the new president of the United States, with Bess Wallace Truman at his side and Margaret Truman at his side. I'd like to share with you one of the pieces of film that survives of the inauguration. It is a silent film, although I really believe that other than the words of the Chief Justice and the oath repeated by Harry Truman, it probably was silent in the room as well, with the exception of perhaps some tears and some sobbing. So shortly after that, Franklin Roosevelt's body was brought back to Washington, D.C., and along the way, mourners lined the way, and then Franklin Roosevelt's body was then taken by train to Hyde Park, New York, and the new president of the United States and his family and the nation mourned the loss of Franklin Roosevelt. And then shortly after that, the new president of the United States addressed the Congress, a body that Harry Truman knew well. And the new country, the country was getting to know their new president and had great hopes that the new president would perhaps be able to work well with this body that he had worked with so well. So I wanted to share with you a little bit of this address.
Harry Truman, long a senator and then vice president, is expected to work closely with Congress, to which he states his policies as the new president.
It is with a heavy heart that I stand before you, my friends and colleagues in the Congress of the United States. Tragic fate has thrust upon us grave responsibilities. We must carry on. With great humility, I call upon all Americans to help me keep up ideals which have been so eloquently proclaimed by Franklin Roosevelt. So that there can be no possible misunderstanding, both Germany, any shadow of a doubt that America will continue the fight for freedom until no vestige of resistance remains. Our unconditional surrender. The grand strategy of the United Nations war has been determined, due in no small measure to the vision of our departed. Part of that strategy, under the able direction of Admiral Leahy, General Marshall, Admiral King, General Arnold, General Eisenhower, Admiral Nimitz, and General MacArthur. I want the entire world to know that this direction must and will remain unchanged and unhampered. I announced that the San Francisco Conference would proceed. We will face the problems of peace with the same courage that we have faced and mastered the problems of those who have made the supreme sacrifice. In the memory of our fallen president, we shall not fail. At this moment, I have in my heart a prayer. As I have assumed my hand, God, in the words of King Solomon, give therefore thy servant an understanding heart, to judge thy people, that I may discern between good and bad. For who is able to judge? I ask only to be a good and faithful servant of my Lord and my people.
David McCullough makes note in his book about how one of the first things Harry Truman did as president of the United States was go and make a personal appearance at the United States Capitol and visit some of his former colleagues, who he still considered colleagues. And within minutes, instead of calling him Mr. President, they were again calling him Harry. And I think that's important to remember, because we often forget that the framers of our system of government envisioned our government having three equal branches of government: the legislature, the executive, and the judiciary. And that's how Harry Truman envisioned it. And that's how Harry Truman envisioned his administration. And he knew that he was inheriting an administration that was still fighting a war. And as he gave that speech to the Congress, he knew that not only the Congress there was listening, he knew that his military leaders were listening. He knew that many people knew that Franklin Roosevelt was listed as a war casualty. He knew that soldiers around the globe were listening to him. He knew that those soldiers needed to know that they had the support of their new president. So then as now, he knew that words mattered. After Harry Truman was inaugurated at 7:09 p.m., April 12th of 1945, the Secretary of War, Henry Stimson, who had had a long public service career, took the new president of the United States aside and said, "Mr. President, there is something of serious importance that we need to discuss." And the new president said, "Okay." So many have had a fascinating discussion over the last 78 years over how much Harry Truman exactly knew about S1 or the Manhattan Project. The general belief is that as United States Senator and as chairman of the so-called Truman Committee, Truman didn't know much about the Manhattan Project. Truman and his investigators had ideas that some serious money was being spent in these different places across the country, in New Mexico and in Tennessee and in Washington State on a secret project, but that the committee and Senator Truman were asked to sort of stay away and to be trustful, and Senator Truman took them at their word. And it's generally accepted that between January 20th of 1945 and then the just over 80 days of the fourth Roosevelt term, that Franklin Roosevelt and Harry Truman had next to no interaction, that Roosevelt really didn't brief Truman at all on the Manhattan Project, that Truman really had no deep background whatsoever on Manhattan. So it may very well be that it wasn't until Truman received this particular memo of April 24th, 1945, where Henry Stimson said, I think it is very important that I should have a talk with you as soon as possible on a highly secret matter. I mentioned it to you shortly after you took office, but have not urged it since on account of the pressures you have been under. It, however, has such a bearing on our present foreign relations and has such an important effect upon all my thinking in this field that I think you ought to know about it without much further delay. Henry Stimson. Truman put it on the list for the next day and he was briefed. So when Truman told reporters shortly after his inauguration, boys, if you ever pray for me now, that the moon, the stars, and all the planets had fallen on me, knowing eventually that knowledge of the atomic bomb was now on the shoulders of Harry Truman, President of the United States. That is the moon, the stars, and all the planets are on the shoulders of Harry Truman now. So when you look at those portraits of Franklin Roosevelt late in life, and you see the wear and tear on his face, that's part of it, knowing that this weapon, that's really something. That's really something. Now, in the middle of all of this, and the nation is still in mourning for Franklin Roosevelt, there is a little bit of lightness. For Mother's Day, May 11th of 1945, Harry Truman invited his mother, Martha Ellen Young Truman, to Washington, D.C. And so Mama Truman made her very first ever airplane flight to visit her son. I just always love thinking about this, that here is a lady born before the American Civil War, is now taking an airplane flight to visit her son, who is now President of the United States. When she arrived, there were so many reporters there that she wasn't crazy about that. And she had that humility that ran in the family. And she said if she knew that all the reporters were going to be there, she said, well, fiddlesticks about that. Her son was very aware of the effect, the lingering effect of the American Civil War on her family's history. Harry Truman's namesake, his uncle Harrison Young, was almost hung by Union soldiers during the Civil War as a young boy. Union soldiers ransacked the family farm near Grandview, Missouri, butchered livestock. Family tradition has that they took off with family gold and forced the family to have to leave the farm to flee up here to Platte County, Missouri. And that lingered in the family, left a bad taste in the family's mouths for years. And Harry Truman knew that, but with a little wry humor, he teased his mother in May of 1945 that he was going to put her up in the Lincoln bedroom, which did not go over well with his mother. And when he told her that, she said, well, then you can just put me on the plane and I'm going back home. But what really did delight the press and the American people here in May of 1945 was that they got to get to know not only the new president and his family, but Mama Truman, Mrs. Truman's mother, the lovely Madge Gates Wallace, in the middle of the ongoing war and such. So a little bit of lightness. Harry Truman, on May 8th of 1945, turned 61 years old. And the timeline of Harry Truman's life is absolutely fascinating. And so on his 61st birthday, it was also VE Day. And so on his 61st birthday, he got to announce to the world victory in Europe. So courtesy of our good friends at the Truman Library Institute, and if you're not familiar with the Truman Library Institute, it's a wonderful organization that supports the work of the Harry S. Truman Presidential Library and Museum and does so much work to specifically support education for our young scholars across the country. I wanted to share a little bit with you about Truman and VE Day.
This is a solemn but a glorious hour. I only wish that Franklin D. Roosevelt had lived to witness this day. General Eisenhower informs me that the forces of Germany have surrendered to the United Nations. The flags of freedom fly all over Europe. For this victory, we join in offering our thanks to the Providence which has guided and sustained us through the dark days of adversity. Our rejoicing is sobered and subdued by a supreme consciousness of the terrible price we have paid to rid the world of Hitler and his evil band. Let us not forget, my fellow Americans, the sorrow and the heartache which today abide in the homes of so many of our neighbors. Neighbors whose most priceless possession has been rendered as a sacrifice to redeem our liberty.
Over 78 years after that effect, we are growing further away from VE Day. As history progresses, I suspect that many of you watching and listening to us today had family who were part of that effort in World War II. And so I tip my Ranger hat to those of you and to those who were part of that effort. There's a wonderful story that David McCullough recalls in his book that as the White House staff grew to accustom themselves to the Truman family, that's really something that the White House staff has to grow used to every 4 or 8 years. The families come and go, but the White House staff, they frequently stay. They're often career. And so everybody from the butlers to the ushers to the kitchen staff, they frequently spend generations there while the White House families come and go. And so you read the story about how, for example, Mrs. Evelyn Nesbit, how her culinary traits did not please the Trumans, and so she was replaced by the wonderful Miss Vieta Garr, who had worked for the Gateses and the Wallaces. And the Trumans, they brought Miss Garr from Kansas City to the White House to bring some Jackson County culinary arts to the White House and to take care of Mrs. Truman's mother, Mrs. Madge Gates Wallace. And you read the story about how Mr. Fields and others tried to make the perfect old fashioned for the Trumans, and they couldn't quite make it right. And so if you are trying to replicate the perfect old fashioned drink recipe, well, there it is. Simply the perfect old fashioned, according to the Trumans, is just simply straight bourbon on ice. Okay, so it's just simple as that. And for some local history here, 219 North Delaware Street, what we call today the Truman home, was technically, in terms of property, the home of Mrs. Truman's mother, Mrs. Madge Gates Wallace. It was aging. Parts of the home dated back to 1867 and then part to 1885, and it was showing its age. The house was originally sort of a gray color. It was built by Mrs. Truman's grandfather and grandmother, Mr. and Mrs. George Porterfield Gates and Mrs. Elizabeth Emery Gates. The paint was failing in several places, and some of the gingerbread was failing in some places. Wood was rotting, porches were rotting, steps were rotting. And now that Harry Truman was president of the United States, and the house wasn't looking so great, the family decided that it was time to flip the house a little bit, to use a modern phrase. And so in early June of 1945, the First Lady and Margaret Truman and Mrs. Madge Gates Wallace, they came home to Independence, and Mrs. Truman oversaw a renovation of 219 North Delaware Street. And there you see some workmen. That's not really an OSHA-friendly photograph there, but there they are. They're painting the house, and they're replacing some rotten wood, and they're replacing some gingerbread and working on some porches and such. And they're doing a nice renovation of the home. And it was for the first time in June of 1945, we think, that the house got its first white coat of paint. And so the press immediately nicknamed the house the Summer White House. And that's what we sort of still call it today. And so every time you drive by 219 North Delaware Street, again, what we call the Truman home today, and you see the white color, that dates to 1945. And every so often we give it a new coat of white paint, thanks to you, the American people, who generously allow us to maintain it. So thank you for allowing us to do that. Now, the American people, in June of 1945, in Independence specifically, the people of Independence passed the hat around in June of 1945, collected money, and bought a flagpole and erected it in the northwest corner of the property. And on that flagpole, when the president was in residence, a flag was raised. And it is just one of the great honors of my life when I raised that flag at 219 North Delaware Street. It just humbles me to think that how many Secret Service agents and others over the years have raised the flag at that flagpole over the last 78 years. And so again, I tip my Ranger hat to all who made that flagpole possible over the years. Also in late June of 1945, President Harry S. Truman witnessed something that he was very proud of, the signing of the Charter of the United Nations. This is something else that he wished that Franklin Roosevelt would have been able to witness, but thankfully Eleanor Roosevelt would play a very important part of that the Charter of the United Nations, which you have just signed, is a solid structure upon which we can build a better world. History will honor you for it. This year and in recent times with recent current events, we hear the United Nations talked about so much. I think Harry Truman would be very proud to see the United Nations playing such an important, vital, and varied role in the world in which we live in 78 years later. Now, in July of 1945, shortly after Harry Truman made his first trip home as President of the United States, he received his first honorary doctorate at the what is now UMKC, which humbled him greatly, almost brought tears to his eyes. He made a state trip to meet with Winston Churchill and Joseph Stalin at Potsdam, Germany, where they were to discuss the post-war world. And I want to show you a couple outtakes from what is called the Screen Gems collection. Now, in the early 1960s, Harry Truman had a television show called Decisions. And what the several-part television series did was discuss the important decisions that Harry Truman made as President of the United States. Like all television shows, there were little parts of the series that didn't make it into the final episodes. And so I wanted to share with you some of these that were recently digitized by the Truman Library. Now, unfortunately, because of the age and the conditions of the clips, there are some parts that are silent. Some of these things were filmed at the Truman Library. Some of these were filmed at Fort Leavenworth. So it's likely that some of these scenes that you see that look like a library were filmed at Fort Leavenworth. So again, some of these are part sound and part silent. I apologize for that, but that again is part of the condition of the film clips. But again, I'm very grateful to the Truman Library for making these available to us. And with these clips, you get a sense that Harry Truman sort of understood the role of history and what he was creating as history.
1407, take one. Roger.
I was the first one to arrive. Winston Churchill was the second one to arrive. He came the day after I arrived, and Stalin was 2 days later. I heard afterwards that Stalin had had a slight heart attack. I didn't find out about it until he had arrived and told me what the trouble was. But each one of us gave a state dinner in turn. I gave the first one, Mr. Churchill gave the second one, and Stalin gave the third one. In Stalin's dinner, he kept drinking out of a bottle. Everybody else was drinking vodka, or trying to. It's hard to get down, you know, if you're not used to it. At any rate, I turned around to him and I said, "That must be a different brand you're drinking." He had a little glass about the size of a thimble. I reached over and took his bottle and poured it in my vodka glass after it was empty, and it was French wine. He wasn't drinking vodka at all. And I said, "You putting one over on us, aren't you?" "Oh, well," he says, "you know, my heart won't stand this heavy drinking, and I have to go slowly." Well, you know, the Russians never put on a dinner without a whole raft of toasts. At the Russian state dinner at Potsdam, they had 14 toasts. And I learned early in the game not to take a drink every time they offered a toast, but just back out like you're taking one, because you would be unable to carry on the business of the meeting. It was an education in itself to be dealing with two brilliant men such as Winston Churchill and Stalin. And they were representing Great Britain and Russia. We had to move all our divisions that had not been used in France during this war, and to move them across the United States and send them to the Pacific, because we still had a war on our hands in the Far East. And it was necessary that that be done. That was one of the reasons for the meeting at Yalta and at Potsdam. we had hoped that Russia would get into the Japanese war on our side. Russia didn't come into the Japanese war until after the bombs had been dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. They saw immediately that Japan was going to surrender, and they wanted to be in to kill. And they came in just about 3 days before the Japanese surrendered. And they caused us so much trouble at Yalta and at the Western European surrender that I made it a point that they would have a representative at the Japanese surrender, but they would have nothing to say about what took place. We didn't have any trouble with them, with the Japanese. We got the thing straightened out the way we wanted it and carried it through to the end. But if the Russians had been able to get in there, they'd have caused us just as much trouble in Japan as they did in Europe. But they didn't have a chance, and that's the only reason they didn't do it.
One of the charming things when Truman was doing these filming sessions for the television series, he would frequently tell the producers, "Don't make a play actor out of me." And I think one of the charming things about Truman when he was doing television interviews was he was always fidgety. He was always rocking in his chair. He was always tapping his foot or going back and forth. And sometimes I do that too. And you'll notice that in these film clips. So he's rarely sitting still. I think it's rather charming.
Speed. Running.
Production 65010. Scene 1001, take 1.
All right, sir. You were going to tell us a story about Queen Victoria and the Tsar.
Well, at my convenience, and I told him that I had not yet become thoroughly seated in the presidential chair, and as soon as I got things straightened out, I'd be glad to come and talk with him. I was rather doubtful about the Russian situation because Queen Victoria had made a statement after 60 years as Queen of Great Britain and Ireland that she wished that she were a man so she could go to Russia and give them the necessary going over so they would keep their agreements. So you see, it was customary in those days for the Russians to break their agreements. We all had an idea that maybe the Bolsheviks, when they got control of that country, might be more reliable, but they turned out to be less reliable, if that's at all possible. But I finally got things in shape so I could go to Potsdam. I had a house over there which they call the White House, but it wasn't yellow. It wasn't white, it was yellow. And I don't know whether that had any effect on the conference or not, that color. At any rate, we went to work and did the best that we possibly could. There was another incident that took place a little later in the conference that was an interesting one, in which the discussion was on the government for Poland at that time, and which showed exactly how his mind ran. He had to be turned out just as his character was shown at that time, that he had to be forced to keep any agreements that he kept. He broke 16 agreements that were made at Yalta, and he broke 32 agreements that were made at Potsdam, 48 altogether. He never kept a single one of them.
If only we knew what was said in those silent sections. This is something I just wanted to share with you. Harry Truman's mother and father were married in December of 1881, and they took a wedding photograph. But that's the last known photograph of John Anderson Truman. He died in November of 1914. And I often wondered, what did John Anderson Truman look like later in life? And again, there are no known photographs taken of him after November or after December of 1881. A few months ago, doing some research in a collection of papers at the Truman Library known as the Merle Miller papers. Merle Miller wrote a book known as Plain Speaking. I found an interesting tidbit in the Merle Miller papers where somebody made a note saying that official photographs of Truman at Potsdam really looked like his father. And so I looked at that, and I looked at photographs of Harry Truman at Potsdam, and I wondered, is that what Harry Truman's father looked like late in life? I wonder. I just thought that was interesting. I thought you might find that too. I wanted to share with you too a little bit from Harry Truman's diary. Now that he knew about the bomb, he knew about the experimenting going on with the atomic bomb, Truman in his diary is reflecting on it. And in his diary entry from July 25th, 1945, he is saying that the weapon is to be used against Japan between now and August 10th. So when he told the reporters a few months before that the moon, the stars, and all the planets are on him, this is weighing on him. So when we talk about the use of the atomic bomb, of course, today in 2023, we are talking about it in hindsight. That now there had been tests that had been done, but still, at the time Truman is writing this is all still sort of hypothetical. But Truman, by this time, had been given some information. Earlier in the summer, former President Herbert Hoover had been talking with some people in the United States military, and some estimates had been given to Herbert Hoover, and some estimates had been given to Harry Truman that by the use of the atomic bomb, America would save between 500,000 and 1 million lives, and that the use of the atomic bomb would save enormous resources. And it would be obvious that peace would save lives and resources of allies as well. This document that I'm showing you here is one of the more controversial documents. It's also a document that David McCullough got a little bit of pushback on when he published Truman back in 1992. And so I wanted to provide for you a link for this so that you could take a look at it. So when you're watching the video, you might want to pause this so you could jot down the URL. And I'm sorry I couldn't shorten it anymore. But my purpose in showing you this is that for the rest of his life, this was a document that provided numbers that remained in Harry Truman's head. That when he made the decision, that was his alone to make, to give to the United States military the authority to use the atomic weapons as a weapon of war against Japan, that he would be doing so as a weapon of war to end the war, to save hundreds of thousands to over 1 million American and Allied lives and end the war. And Truman would maintain that for the rest of his life. I'm sorry, let me get back to the, I'm sorry, I pushed the wrong button. He would maintain that for the rest of his life. He would maintain that in the summer of 1945. He would maintain that for the rest of 1946, 47, 48, for the rest of his presidency. And even in 1964, I wanted to share this letter with you. August of 1964, written to Mrs. Hayden Klein, Route 2, Box 100 in Alabama, Atala, Alabama, I think it's pronounced. In reply to yours of the 28th of July, the matter about which you wrote me, the atomic bomb, is one that is of interest to most people. The only reason the atomic bomb was used was because it was a weapon of war. When I was on the way home from Potsdam, I sent a message to the Japanese government asking them to surrender unconditionally, and I hoped that would end the war. They refused, and then I ordered the bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, just as I would have used the long gun as the Germans did in the First World War. The dropping of those bombs ended the war, and that was the objective. There is nothing to take home with you to sleep with. It was a means to end the war and save 250,000 men from being killed on our side, and that many on the Japanese side, plus twice that many being injured for life. You will find this information in my memoirs and in any other documents. I've never worried about the dropping of the bomb. It was just a means to end the war. And that is what was accomplished. Sincerely yours, Harry Truman. And that's one of the last documents that I can find where Truman at least publicly references the bomb. I wanted to share with you where Truman addresses the American people about the bomb. I'm sorry, folks.
A short time ago, an American airplane dropped one bomb on Hiroshima and destroyed its usefulness to the enemy. That bomb has more power than 20,000 tons of TNT. The Japanese began the war from the air at Pearl Harbor. They have been repaid many-fold, and the end is not yet. With this bomb, we have now added a new and revolutionary increase in destruction to supplement the growing power of our armed forces. In their present form, these bombs are now in production, and even more powerful forms are in development. It is an atomic bomb. It is a harnessing of the basic power of the universe. The force from which the sun draws its power has been loosed against those who brought war to the Far East. We are now prepared to destroy more rapidly and completely every productive enterprise the Japanese have in any city. We shall destroy their docks, their factories, and their communications. Let there be no mistake. We shall completely destroy Japan's power to make war. it was to spare the Japanese people from utter destruction that the ultimatum of July the 26th was issued at Potsdam. Their leaders promptly rejected that ultimatum. If they do not now accept our terms, they may expect a rain of ruin from the air, the like of which has never been seen on this earth. Behind this air attack will follow sea and land forces in such numbers and power as they have not yet seen, and with the fighting skill of which they are already well aware. We have spent more than $2 billion on the greatest scientific gamble in history, and we have won. But the greatest marvel is not the size of the enterprise, its secrecy, or its cost, but the achievement of scientific brains in making it work. And hardly less marvelous has been the capacity of industry to design and of labor to operate the machines and methods to do things never done before. Both science and industry work together under the direction of the United States Army, which achieved a unique success in an amazingly short time. It is doubtful if such another combination could be got together in the world. What has been done is the greatest achievement of organized science in history.
And I would propose to you, friends, that these two documents are perhaps the most important in presidential, if not American history. This document, which is War 41011 from the Secretary of War, a time schedule, and then on the reverse of that, to the Secretary of War, reply to your 41011, suggestions approved, release when ready, but not sooner than August 2nd, HST. Well, this document is held by the Harry S. Truman Presidential Library and Museum. And to have been there at the moment when President Harry S. Truman put his initials on that paper that set the wheels in motion for that. And we have to remember the other side of the equation in Japan when the men, women, and children received the warnings. Read this carefully as it may save your life or the life of a relative or a friend. They were very real human beings in Japan as well. And so we need to remember that side of the equation as well. And so victory in Japan was eventually announced from the Oval Office. And I look at this photograph as well, particularly not just the reporters in the office and the President of the United States, but in the center of the photograph is the First Lady of the United States looking at her husband. They met at Sunday school in 1890, went to school together, graduated high school together in 1901, started dating in 1910, married in 1919, had gone through life together, and now she's watching him announce the end of World War II as President of the United States, a man who had made the most consequential decision of any human being in history. Can you imagine what is going through her mind? There's so much to think about. I hope that you'll consider joining us for our next session, which is August 3rd, 2023. We will talk about the challenges that President Harry S. Truman and America faced and the world faced in the post-World War II era as we began to face challenges in housing in the United States, jobs in the United States, challenges that women faced in the United States, how the United States was helping to rebuild Japan and Europe, and how the economy is faring, and more. So August 3rd, 2023 at 2:00 p.m. As always, if there's anything from this presentation that you would like a copy of, please send me an email and I would be happy to get that to you. I thank you for joining us. We apologize for the technical glitches with this. I'm still learning my way with this. And as always, thank you for joining us. And I thank Mid-Continent Public Library for your friendship and support. I wish you a very peaceful day.
Thank you so much as ever, Doug, for sharing the wealth of knowledge that you have. And like you said, we will be back next Thursday, August 3rd at 2 p.m. So please feel free to reach out, and we appreciate you all being here. So have a great rest of the day.